All right, so I have moved the camera. I'm gonna hope this is an angle where you guys can see well. And also I lifted my slab up and I put a plastic bag down. The reason I put the plastic bag down is that my clay was sticking to the surface a bit. And I'm gonna need to pick the pieces up to move them after I roll this out and cut it. So if it's on the plastic, it's gonna help it from sticking to the board. So at this point, I trimmed a little off the edges because it was wider than what my rolling pin is. So I want to go ahead and take my two little guides, and again, I'm trying to find something that is about the thickness of a pencil or the width of a needle tool, and I'm using that as a guide so that I can get my clay to be the proper thickness. Now, if you don't have something as a guide, then you can just lay your needle tool on the side edge of your clay and take a look at it and see if it's about the thickness of the needle tool or of a pencil, and that will be good enough for this. But if you can get some guides to get your clay the proper thickness throughout, then I suggest doing that. So I'm putting these down so that when I roll my clay, it won't go any thinner than the thickness of the wood boards. You could use strips of cardboard, you could use a couple magazines, maybe a couple thin children's books, whatever is equal to about the thickness of a pencil. So then I'm going to take my rolling pin. If you don't have a rolling pin, you could use a wine bottle, you could use a piece of PVC pipe, you could use a broom handle, you could use maybe the handle on the end of a plunger, something like that. So you're going to just roll out your clay now, and you want to roll it out so that the roller is actually hitting the surface of our guides. And what that's going to do is make our clay that thickness all the way through. Just make sure that your guides are no wider than what your rolling pin is, or whatever you're using, so that the rolling pin doesn't go down inside the guides and make your clay thinner. So I'm going to roll this out, and I think we got it there. That should do it. And now we can go ahead and cut our pieces. So I'm going to set one of these sticks aside. I don't need it at the moment. I'm going to use a needle tool to cut with, and what I'm going to do initially is just use this board as a straight edge, hoping it's straight. If you have a ruler or a yardstick, you could use that. And I'm going to go ahead and trim off some of this clay, so I start with a nice straight edge. So at this point, I'm going to peel that clay away, hopefully. May want to stick to my bag here. See if we can get that started so it'll peel up away. There we go. So now we want to measure our pieces. And I put in the assignment in Canvas that you've got two pieces, a bottom piece and a top piece. The bottom goes this way, the top goes right over this way, crossways over it. Now when we cut them, it helps to do it this way because they're both 8 inches long. So what I'm going to do is measure 8 inches across. So I'll take my ruler, and at one end off of my straight edge, I'm going to go ahead and measure 8 inches and make a mark. I'm going to do the same thing at the other end, and that will give me 2 marks to line up on so that when I cut this, I know I have a nice 8-inch wide strip. So go ahead and take your straight edge, line up on those 2 marks, and cut that and peel it away. Okay, so now what we want to do is I could use these cardboard pieces as a template, but since you guys don't have that at home, I'm trying to do everything measuring it out the way I would expect you guys to do at home. So if you can find something that is a nice 90-degree angle, could be the edge of a book, a magazine, whatever you might have on hand. So what I'm going to do is use this just because it's a piece of cardboard, and I'm going to make a mark at the top, and I'm going to use my ruler and line up on those marks, and I'm going to cut away that clay so that I know I have a nice 90-degree edge there. So in other words, it's a nice square piece of clay. squared edge. So this first one, we want to be 6.5 inches wide. So I'm going to measure off my nice squared edge now, 6.5 inches, and I'm going to make a mark. And I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing on the other side. Don't just eyeball it, because it'll come up crooked and then your project won't look square. Make sure you're going ahead and you're measuring it. So line up on those 2 marks, and we will cut straight across, and that'll give us a nice square piece. Okay? So the second piece, which is going to be our top piece, is 8 inches by 5.5 inches. So we're just going to go ahead off that straight line we just cut, measure down 5.5 inches, make a mark. Do the same thing on the other side again. Make our mark. And then we'll go ahead, line our ruler up on the marks, and we'll make our final cut. And these are the 2 pieces that we will use for our project. So at this point, I'm going to transfer the bottom piece to a wood board to work on. If you've got a piece of newspaper, a magazine, if you can find a wood board, that's ideal. Just makes it easy to transport and to move around. If not, and you want to leave it on the surface you're working on, by all means you can do that. Whatever is easiest for you. So I'm going to go ahead and carefully lift my slab up. The thing about working with slabs is that as you work with them, what you'll find is that the more you handle them, you can already see mine has a little bit here, the more they will distort. So I'm going to try and line this up on the edge of my board just because it'll make it easier in the long run. So I'm going to keep the nicer edge, the top of my project. So at this point, I'm going to take the top piece, and it was 5.5 inches wide. So I'm going to measure up from the bottom 5.5 inches and make a little mark. And I'm going to do that on each side. And this is going to let me know where to cross hatch and slip on the project. So at this point, these 3 sides on our pouch pot, if I show you again, are where we're going to be attaching our clay. So at this point, what I want to do is cross hatch these 3 sides in order to prep it. Now I can sit here and I can use my needle tool and do it little by little. It takes me a long time. Or I can use a fork where it's much quicker. And since we're not going to see these crosshatch marks when we're finished, I can go ahead and be, in a sense, a little sloppy about it, because the top piece is going to cover this. So I'm going to go ahead and cross hatch. It's just etching a series of lines into the clay going one direction and then coming back over the opposite direction, cross hatching into it. And that's just going to rough up the weave of the clay, and it's going to help it to join. All right, so there's the first piece. Now I'm going to do the same thing on the top piece. So what I usually will do is I will take a look at my slab, and I will go ahead and decide which side looks like the better piece. In other words, if one side looks neater and cleaner than the other side, that's the side I'll make the top. So I'm kind of liking this side over here as my top. So I'm going to flip this over, and this is the back side. So what I'm going to do is cross hatch all 3 sides, because that's where I'm going to be joining it. So again, just go ahead and quickly, roughly cross hatch all 3 sides. Again, this is going to be the underside. You're not going to see this. So you can be a little bit rough with it in terms of it doesn't have to look super neat and beautiful and clean, because nobody's going to see this in the end. But we do want to go ahead and make sure we cross hatch inside about 1 inch, because as we shape this and fold this, we want to make sure we have plenty of a section that's going to join. Okay, so now we're going to take our good old slip, and if you remember, slip is basically clay with water added to it until it becomes nice and creamy, kind of like a yogurt consistency. So I always stir mine up before I start to use it, If it sits overnight, a lot of times what will happen is the water will kind of rise to the top, so you want to go ahead and make sure you get it mixed up well. So I'm going to take my bottom piece here, and I'm going to go ahead and paint slip over the area where I crosshatched. I'm trying to do this fast for the sake of the video, so it's not too lengthy. Use plenty of slip. You can always wipe away the extra, but if you skimp on it and you don't use enough, that's kind of like skimping on the glue that's going to bind it. So make sure you use plenty. And we're going to go ahead and do the same thing on the top piece. Almost there. And you can be a little sloppy on this, because like I say, it's the underside. Nobody's going to see this when you're all finished. Okay, that should be plenty there. So we'll set that aside. So now, before we pick this up and put it on here, we need some sort of a mold to actually create the pouch part. So what I like to use is just good old newspaper. If you don't have newspaper, you might check your flyers in your mail, see if you've got ads from your grocery store. I know I get things from Stumps, from Vaughn's, from Ralph's, from Sprouts, and they're made of newsprint, so you can use that. If you don't have newsprint, you could use some paper towel. Worst case scenario, you could take an old rag or a sock and you could use that. So if you use newsprint, I like one full sheet like this. That's really all you need. And then what you'll do is just kind of hold it in the center and then basically squeeze and scrunch and tuck the excess clay underneath that center part. It kind of creates a neat little like pouch or pocket. And just kind of squish that down until it creates a nice little mound, okay? We don't want it to be extremely large because we're stretching our clay over it, but we do need it to be big enough that we get a decent pouch. And what you can do is just set this down here, press it a little bit, just squish it in there, and then that's going to sit basically right in the center. So I'm going to turn this around this way. It'll make it a little easier for me. And I'm going to go ahead and carefully pick this up. Now remember, your slab is moist and it's wet, and it wants to stretch. If you grab it or press your fingers into it, it'll make marks. So we want to try and keep it neat and clean. So when we pick it up and we move it, we try to be super careful. So now what I'm going to do is take the bottom and I'm going to line it up with the bottom of the top piece and line it up with the bottom of the bottom piece. And it's going to drape over the pouch, and I'm just going to carefully start to press it down. Now you're going to have some overhang on each side, so try to make it an equal amount of overhang on both sides. Okay, I'm going to turn it there so you can see. All right, maybe I'll pick it up. So try and get the same amount of overhang on both sides. Then what I'm going to do is just lightly press this down to get it started. Then I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing on the sides. Slide it. The nice thing about plenty of slip is it will be a little forgiving. It'll slide if you need to move it a little bit. So try to get it so it's nice and even. Just lightly press. Don't push hard. Your clay is soft, so at this point if you push hard into it, it's tactile. It's going to pick up all your little finger marks. We want to try to keep this nice, simple, smooth, plain, looking nice and clean. Now you'll notice on the sample project, it has texture here. We use rain gutter guards as templates here in class so you can create different textures. You don't have that at home, so this year, rather than a textured pouch pot, we're going with smooth. So when you have things smooth and they're simple, then we want to try and make them as perfect as we can, because when they're plain and simple, the imperfections are more easily seen. So we've got that pushed down and joined, and you can see it's kind of distorted at this point. So now we're going to clean it up. So what we're going to do is take our needle tool and we're going to trim some off of each edge and a little off the bottom to square it up. So at this point, I'm going to take my needle tool and my ruler, and I'm going to try and line this up as best I can. You can kind of hold it in whichever manner you need to. Just make sure as you're cutting it, the ruler doesn't move. So I'm going to go ahead and place it there just gently, and I'm going to push down. Luckily my clay is nice and soft, so I don't have to use a lot of pressure, and I'm going to peel the excess off. It'll cut away some of the top and the bottom, and that's okay. Just be careful when you put this here that you don't push down with the ruler too much, because it'll leave a line down the side. And again, we're trying to keep this nice and neat. So now I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I'll turn it so hopefully you can see. I'm going to go ahead and line this up just gently, enough to hold it there in place. Try and not press too hard. And I'm just going to use my needle or my knife, whatever you have at home that you're using, and cut that away. And then carefully remove the ruler. And that should give me a basically nice square sides. Now the bottom, if you did put it on a board, you can use that as your guide instead of a ruler. If you didn't put it on a board, then you'll just take your ruler and you'll stand it up next to it, and you'll go ahead and cut it against the ruler. Since I have the board there, I'm going to put my needle tool up against the edge of it, and I'm just going to drag it along the board. Obviously, you want your board to be straight, so you get a straight cut along there. If your board's not straight, then you're not going to get that straight cut. Okay? So at this point, I'm going to go back. I'm just going to lightly press down my edges, make sure that I have that joined really well. Okay? So at this point, we're going to put little marks in the side here. I call them crimp marks. And what that does, it just reinforces the join so that the clay gets squeezed together. It just helps make a better join rather than just leaving it like this, where possibly if you didn't get enough slip or you didn't press it together well enough, that as it dries it could crack and come apart. So to make that little crimp, you could use the backside of a knife, the backside of a spoon in terms of the handle to press down. If you bought the tools in your ceramic kit, you'll have a wood knife. And I like this back end of a tongue depressor. And I like the wood because usually the clay doesn't stick to the wood as much. If you have a popsicle stick at home, you could use something like that. Worst case scenario, if you can't find anything, you could just take your thumb and press in. It's going to be basically the same size and the same shape as this. So since I have the wood knife here, that's what I'm going to demonstrate with. And let me just move this up. Hopefully everything's in the camera. You're going to go ahead and take this. I think just 3 crimp marks on each side is plenty. You're going to press it down just about, enough for the tool to reach the surface depending on how thick it is. We don't want to smash it down in. Maybe just a little deeper than I went there. And then slide it out. Now it's going to distort your edge here a little bit. Don't worry about that at this point. Go ahead and space it out, one in the middle and then one in between the middle and the outside edge, and make it as nice and as neat as you can. Just press down, slide it out of there. Like I say, you could just use your thumb if you needed to. So I'm going to turn this and do the same thing on the edge, starting in the middle, and I'm just eyeballing it. If you want to actually measure it to find the exact middle, that's up to you. But I think if you have a good set of eyes, you can look at it and find the middle fairly simply. And then one more up near the top edge. And again, you're just pushing it in and then dragging it out. If you push it in and try and lift it straight up, a lot of times the tool will want to stick. So I'm going to turn and do the final side here. Again, start in the middle, just press down and slide it out. You don't have to go in real far, like way in with your tool. Just about, I would say, a 1/2 inch to 1 inch is plenty. Press that down and then just drag it out. Try to, whichever you decide, try to make it consistent. You know, if you want to make a design, one goes in a little further, the other one comes out. that's fine. But if you're going to do all three the same, try to be consistent and make them all the same. So at this point, we've got our basic pouch pot, and I'm going to hold it up here so you can see the basic pouch pot. We've got the newspaper down inside, and we will leave that newspaper in there until this gets leather hard. Now, one other thing we can do at this point is we can make a hole to hang this by on the top side. And this is where I would actually measure. So that way, if the weight and everything is even, when you hang this, your pouch pot's going to hang even. If you get it off center and the weight's even, it's going to hang crooked. So if I go ahead and I measure this, it's 6.5 inches. So that would be, half of that would be 3 1/4, right? New math, old math, I think it's still the same. So I'm going to make a little mark at 3 1/4 inches. And then try and drop down about 1 inch from the top. What happens is if you make your hole too close to the top edge of your pouch pot, when it dries and it shrinks, this will crack right in here. So if you move down about 1 inch, 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch, that should give you plenty of space so that this doesn't crack as it dries and shrinks and as it fires. So at this point, to make that hole, what I tend to do is if I've got a pencil, if I've got a needle tool, an X-Acto knife, whatever I'm using, I just use the back side of it. So I'm going to go ahead and set that right in there at this point, put it in the middle, and then just press down. I tend to give it a little wiggle or a little twist, not a lot, just a little, and then pull that out of there. And that should give you a nice hole there. Now, sometimes as it dries and shrinks, when you take this off the board, you may need to go back and double check that hole and make sure that it pushed all the way through, nothing's got clogged into it. But that should do it at this point. So, pretty simple so far, right? Didn't take too long. The hardest part is just making the slab. So at this point, I would go and clean this up. And again, as always, I'm trying to round all my edges. I'm trying to sponge and smooth everything. So the clay is still very moist at this point. So when you sponge this, you want to be very careful, because if you push too hard, you're going to change the shape of it. You're going to add dents into it. So I take my sponge, I squeeze all the water out, and I just lightly start to drag the sponge over it. And it just rounds off the edges, smooths out any marks. If I did get any finger marks or any slip got smeared on anything, it just starts to clean it up and make it look neater. Sometimes if I feel like my clay is too soft, then I will give this a chance to dry for maybe, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes out in the open air, maybe a period, and then I'll come back and I'll work to go ahead and clean it up so that once it firms up a little bit, then I can sponge a little more, I guess you might say, aggressively, and that way it's not going to push in and change its shape because it's already dried and set up a little bit. Whereas while the clay is super moist like this, if I push too hard, then what's going to happen is it's going to go ahead and change the shape of my pouch pot, which I don't want to have happen. Okay, so I will continue on with this, basically sponging, smoothing, cleaning it up, and then I'm just going to let it hang out on this board and go ahead and get a little bit of air. At the end of the day, I will then go ahead and try and slide it into the bag, but leave the bag puffed open. At this point, I do want it to start to dry, but I don't want it to dry so quickly that it kind of shocks or shrinks the clay quickly and causes this to get a crack or to split. So I'm going to set this aside for a little bit, and hopefully when it has firmed up, I will come back and make a finished video showing what to do when you're completely done with it. Now, one other option I will tell you is if you decide you want to decorate yours and personalize it, what you could do is you could go ahead and cut out of a slab or create designs in crosshatch and slip, maybe your family name on here, maybe some designs, flowers, whatever you might have. You could do the same thing up here. If you wanted to round these edges so that it's not just totally square, you could try and do that as well. So you can decorate it however you'd like, or you can just leave it plain. Just remember, when you leave things plain, we want to try to make them as perfect as possible, because when they're plain, all the little imperfections show up. So we're not going to worry about the newspaper at this point. When this gets leather hard and it will hold its shape, I'll come back and I'll do a quick short little video on how to finish it up, taking the newspaper out, putting the drain hole in the back if you want one, and so forth. But that is your first slab construction assignment. And again, we refer to this as a pouch pot. All right, hope you guys have a great day, and we'll let this dry up and we'll come back with another short finished video.